Okay, all right, thank you. So let's put it in a full screen so that people can see.
All right, here, and go back to full screen mode here.
All right, so thank you. So thanks for joining us today. So this is Kandan Kadruvel. I'm a group product manager in Google Cloud, also the TSD chair for Nephio. And I also have Sana here. She is a principal technical architect from TELUS. She is a vice chair for Nephio project. And today we're going to share you the Nephio project overview. Also, we will talk about like what's coming up in the release one of the Nephio and the progress that is already made by the community. And we will leave like a few minutes at the last for Q&A. And it is a very early morning for us, like very happy to join you guys today. And with that, let's go to the next slide. So telecom is having a lot of challenges with respect to the changes that is happening in the industry, but including like a conversion from a physical network function and to a virtual network function, and mainly conversion into the container network function. And the journey started with the VNFs, and the people started using the CNF, but the full benefit of the CNF is not completely achieved by the telecoms. And due to many issues that including that the Kubernetes was not fully put into use, and the telecoms has been hosting the CNF in Kubernetes, but has not been using the full potential of the Kubernetes, similar to what enterprises are doing. And there's also a lot of challenges with respect to the configuration management of the network functions and the cloud infrastructure and the interdependency associated with that. And that challenges causes like many operational issues for a telecom. And that is exactly where the Nephio project really comes in. We will deep dive with you and explain you actually why we created this project and what exactly this project is trying to do. So with that said, and this project is really putting full potential of Kubernetes use to the telecom. And that's what exactly we're going to talk to you about. And with that, Sana, please take it over.
Sounds good. Thank you so much, Kandan. Good morning, everyone. I hope you have been enjoying the Elephant Developers and Testers Summit so far. Today, myself and Kandan are helping go through the overview of Nephio and walk you through some of the fundamental concepts before we dive into the subsequent sessions that are planned for today. If we review what Kandan said, the journey, where did this start from? We made a significant amount of progress since the inception of NFV. A lot of telco standards like HCA 3GPP have approached to solve the problem of service orchestration in the telco space, but we have not yet achieved the full goals of our agility, managing day 2 plus ops or managing the KPIs of our cloud transitions and our improvement in the time to market. There has been a lot of improvements in the space, but we are still facing some challenges in our cloud native approach on how do we accomplish scale and stability in our automation approach. So the journey started at the left-hand side, as Kandan mentioned. We had physical network functions. We ported them over into virtual network functions. Now,
sorry, are you presenting something on the slide, or because it is the same slide as before? Is it normal?
Yes.
Okay,
yes,
just to make sure.
It's the same slide. I was just giving it a warm-up touch before we go dive into the next few slides here.
Okay,
so,
sorry.
Yep, that's a good question. We are managing these logistics on the Zoom, right? So the left-hand side is showing the journey where the VNF started, and the right-hand side is showing our transition into containers, now where we are. And even being in containers, we have a large number of challenges, which we are still working as an industry to solve. The templates that we're using are non-declarative, are the way we are working with Helm charts is a lot more complex. We will discuss that in detail in the coming slides. We also haven't yet achieved a full cloud native CNF, which can exploit the benefits of Kubernetes, which is what we are using at the moment. And we will see why we are not able to use Kubernetes and its native orchestration and closed loop functions, and why Nephio can actually play a big role in that and how we can use that. So as a fundamental principle, we need to make our automation faster, simpler, and easier. And that's what we are going to discover, how Nephio can help us achieve that. So we will discuss what is happening in the existing work stream. When we started working on the telco network functions orchestration, with the evolution of our ETSI standards and all the other open source and industry projects that we have been working with, there has been a lot of heterogeneity across the way we are using those templates and across how the network functions configurations is handled and how we are building those templates. There's a lot of work that has gone into this effort, but we have seen over the years the challenges that we have been facing. So there are two parallels evolving at the same time. One is Kubernetes, which is tried and tested, a very scalable container orchestration, and we knew that container orchestration is extendable to perform a lot more than what it's capable of doing. And at the same time, looking at how the telco network functions are evolving and what kind of needs are evolving in telco network functions, we knew they have SRIOV and DPDK and CPU pages and huge pinning, which are not natively expressed in Kubernetes. So of course, the extensions like VNF managers and NFUs are required to be able to control the end-to-end application as well as the service management aspects. Nephio is a project which is extending the Kubernetes to be able to control and see all these new extensions in the resource layer, which are coming natively as a requirement for telco network functions. And we also explored over the years that the network functions have very strong dependencies to the infrastructure, and the infrastructure configuration in itself is a big part of our automation. And generally, the way we are approaching the infrastructure automation and the network function automation is an out-of-band exercise. And one VNF manager or the NFO option doesn't help us solve all of that in band in a coherence. And we realized that we have been working with Helm charts as we transition into the CNF's world. Working with the Helm charts for over last many years, I have seen they are not portable. They have very, very complex values files. And every time we are working from site to site, there is a lot of rework that needs to be done in order to update the Helm chart to reflect the new site requirements. It's also an extension. It's also a template of Kubernetes, which is supported. But in the project Nephio, as we will go through the details in the next few slides, we are trying to overcome some of these challenges and problems because we have introduced operators and CRDs to make it more intent-driven and more declarative as we learn more about the project. So continuing to go deeper in the concept of Nephio, and if I can describe that in detail, on the very left-hand side, we are showing the world when VMs were not born, and we were partially in VMs, and we were trying to automate that, and CNFs were not born yet. Then moving into the left-hand side column, we were in an era, which is the present time, in which we are managing our infrastructure through Kubernetes, and that is one orchestration layer. And then there is another orchestration, which is managing our network function deployment, network function configuration, our service deployment, and service management from end to end through our Mano architecture. And this model is, of course, out of band. We work on a different CI/CD pipeline or some automation model to configure our infrastructure for the requirements of the incoming network functions. And then we work on templates in another tool and another layer to manage the deployment of network functions in the form of our CNFs. And we are managing those CNFs cross-stitching through, of course, our Tosca-driven models like NSDs. The whole approach has a potential of evolving to use the Nephio approach, which is shown on the very right-hand side. This last column indicates how we would solve the same problem with Nephio. Now, this is all in band. Nephio is essentially the extension of Kubernetes. It's nothing new. It's the use of Kubernetes native constructs that were always there, but an idea that we could use CRDs and operators instead of the Helm charts, and we could extend those CRDs and operators to manage the full life cycle of the infrastructure deployment configuration, the network function deployment configurations, and the service management end to end through those similar constructs. And hoping that we will be able to describe a little bit more detail on the Nephio in the upcoming slide.
So, good morning, Sana. This is Mudassar.
Hi.
Considering that the telco will use PNFs, VNFs, and CNFs, and if Nephio is only sort of Kubernetes environment specific, then you're probably going to need another tool on a higher abstraction layer to manage the 3 different flavors of virtualization.
Yes, you will.
Okay, thank you.
Right. And for CNFs, there could be a plugin to basically help you connect to the rest of your end-to-end automation. I'm not able to advance my slides. I think now I can. Okay, so cloud native network automation along with cloud infrastructure will be a fundamental building block to achieve the autonomous network vision. That's the statement of Nephio. And I hope that with this overview, we will be able to dig deeper and deeper on how this makes us cloud native and why it's simple and why it's scalable and why it's so easy to develop and grow over time. And of course, that also depends on a lot of community work and adoption over the years. But fundamentally, the vision statement actually describes that. So assuming that a lot of us are very familiar with the existing brownfield automation approach that we are currently using in our network functions deployment, we create our Helm charts and we deploy that with some tools, some CNF or VNF managers, and we have another layer of Nephio operating on the top, and generally we work on information models like NSDs. That's the way we are currently deploying our network functions, and generally the policy, the way we write is written in a different language, which actually correlates with our templates written in the form of CNFDs and VNFDs, and we build that control loop. And those policies are written in many different tools, and they're written in discrete places. Now, the concept of Nephio introduces a unified approach to go from intent to be able to validate the intent and go into an infinite loop to ensure that that intent is constantly validated. So for example, all the additional network function related resources, the SRAO, VDPT keys, CPU pages, a huge pairing, everything is expressed as custom resources, which are now extendable and visible to the Kubernetes layer. The custom resource definitions that we write on the top is managing the state, our intent, which is the middle layer. And then our ability to write operators, which runs on those CRDs, is taking us into infinite loop of managing that drift to constantly bring those resources back into the ideal state. And that control loop is all written in natively expressed Kubernetes constructs. So going from intent to the execution to managing an infinite loop or through Kubernetes native constructs is a very powerful way for us to achieve a full closed loop on our applications, as well as taking us one step closer to our full day 2 plus managed ops, which has been a big incentive for telco network functions. And we have achieved to some extent through our automation so far, but it's still a big challenge on how do we make it scalable and how do we make it more dynamic and how do we ensure that the design or the architecture is going to scale for a large number of discrete network function types. The way I describe the the CRDs and operators are written in 3 distinct pools. One is for infrastructure configuration that is shown on the very left-hand side. Then the next group of our CRDs and operators is for CNF deployment, and then the right-hand side, the CNF configuration itself. And all these 3 distinct out-of-band exercises of your automation can be coupled into one vision, which is the concept of Nephio. And since working in the Kubernetes constructs, operators, and CRDs, it is also very easy to combine that with our CI/CD toolkit and apply all the DevOps principles to our process on how we are achieving the end-to-end automation and how we are managing and how we are making it scalable. Now, another beauty of open source, which I'm very passionate about, is that when we are working in a large number of tools and they're coming from discrete number of vendors and the underlying technology is different and proprietary, we have to learn and manage the skill set in a very different way. But if it's all Kubernetes based, I think there is a common denominator across all the private and public cloud providers. There is some flavor of Kubernetes available everywhere, which actually shares the skill set across the industry, and we can port and navigate and share our skill set and our knowledge commonly across the industry. And I feel that there is going to be a large momentum working in this approach while accelerating our journey towards becoming more cloud native and cloud first in the years to come. I can take a question if somebody has raised hand.
Okay, that's me, Łukasz. I have a basic question, because here in the presentation you focus mostly on the perspective of the end user, and the end user in this particular way will mostly play with the CRs, so the interface towards the orchestration layer somehow will be different than it was in the past. So like you said, in the past we had REST APIs for different microservices and different models, declarative ones, but at the end, in order to perform the orchestration process, you had to call different APIs and somehow push your intent in a manual way. However, here in this approach, we just declare the state how it is happening in the Kubernetes in general, declaring what is our intent, and then the all magic, in fact, is done by the Kubernetes operator. But in fact, the all magic is hidden in the Kubernetes operator. So here we have a lot of logic to keep this consistency, the state, and the interpretation of the intent, right? So my basic question is whether the Nephio aims to implement the operator on its own from scratch, or will rather use some existing solutions for that, because really the most essential part of this entire concept is the implementation of the particular operators for the concrete CRDs handling, right?
Right. Good question. I think there were 2 elements in your questions, if I've understood them correctly. You were talking about the management of your CNF deployment construct through your intent-driven or the information models upstream. For example, the gray box here shows the end-to-end service orchestration. I believe we would still be using REST APIs, but those APIs are not developed yet. And of course, the Nephio community and the roadmap is working towards extending those APIs upstream to all our upstream systems to be able to manage that from another system, of course, if that requires some kind of service chaining or stitching to other functions like someone else described in the beginning of our discussion. So the REST APIs would still be available and extended at some point. The second part of your question is that who will write operators? Now, we are learning as the community is evolving that the operators are coming in 3 different pools, right? The way we mentioned. The operators for the infrastructure could be coming from cloud providers because that's what the cloud is becoming a contributor in the overall automation paradigm. Similarly, the operators for the network function deployment and configurations could be coming from either cloud plus that vendor or the vendor itself, that we are still seeing how the community is evolving around that. And I'm also hoping that eventually there will be a bigger reusability factor to those operators eventually. as cloud native functions become more cloud native, and we could describe them with similar resources on the cloud. It's a dream. I know that it might not happen right away. There will be many differences. There will be many different flavors on how they are defined on cloud and how they're expressed. But over the years, we might see a much higher reusability factor across these operators. But for now, it's in the process of evolution. Go ahead.
So Nephio will deliver its own Kubernetes operators, or rather will rely on operators delivered from, let's say, external parties, different kind.
And in the community, in the community, we are currently working on some open, free 5GC kind of network functions at the moment. And we are developing those ourselves because it's open source. But if we start to approach taking a use case, for example, a network function vendor will have to play a big part in helping us develop the operator, because there is a lot of vendor specific knowledge in the operators when we are writing that specifically for the network function deployment and network function configuration. So imagine the model will be like Helm charts. The Helm charts, we can't write them ourselves. We need the vendor's knowledge in the Helm chart to be able to deploy that network function and configure that, right? It would be the same with operators, that part is not changing. But then operator itself would be a little bit more flexible than how we have been managing that work with Helm and scripts to deploy their configurations.
Okay, thanks.
I will quickly move into the next few slides that we have on, and then I will leave it to Kandan to finish the later part of the presentation. So a lot of discussion has been happening since One Summit, and since we have evolved in this community from our community members as well, since we have been in a lot of those discussions on how do we work with brownfield. Our existing service orchestration system and our existing evolution on the 3GPP side for network slicing and all the work that has gone into the industry, how would that intersect with the project Nephio? And one common answer that I always give within my organization and as well as in community, Nephio is going to just improve everything that we have been envisioning on the 3GPP side for network slicing and all these agile end-to-end lifecycle management of services. Because at the moment, the way it's evolving, it is giving us a lot of efficiency on the last mile, where we are managing our hardest part, deployment of network functions, configuration of network functions, and managing the infrastructure provisioning and making it ready and available to the upstream systems, for example, shown in the upper level of the block. And if we want to use Nephio as a domain orchestrator, that would just extend one of the plugins to the Nephio, and we will be able to manage that resource and that domain, just like we are managing the other domains. And this domain can be extended to core for all core network functions, and this can be extended into our RAN. Eventually, there has been a lot of interest in the ORAN. How do we start working on one of the RAN use cases and extend our interfaces to the ORAN and evolve our domain into that, which is of course one of the use cases that SIG-ARC will take in future, and there is a lot of potential to build synergies with those additional standard bodies in open source projects. I'm going to summarize something that we discussed already. There are three most important fundamental principles on how we are working with Nephio. One is the intent-based automation. For example, a simplified configuration to the user, deploy 5G UPF with X capacity at Y location and do Z with this. That's the intent-based approach. And we are familiar with the intent-based approach even from our previous learnings in the orchestration, how we are working with that in higher order modeling languages. And it's declarative configuration. We can manage that all through our closed loops, and we can have full lifecycle support. And it's non-complex because it's using Kubernetes, and its expression of all of our constructs is done through Kubernetes, and Kubernetes has been tested for its scale and time in the container orchestration. And now we are proposing an idea, of course, to Nephio in the industry, that we want to use the exact same approach for network functions deployment and configuration, which is one construct, one tool across all of our network functions in a very simplified and scalable way. And these are a few building blocks for Nephio. The topmost layer shows how we are eventually going to evolve from our community-based use case developments into extending our UIs and CLIs, which can manage the underlying components. For example, how we are building a designer studio and other automation projects, we can extend that to extend the user friendliness. The intent design is the left-hand side functional block where we are designing the network services, designing the intent and packaging that and managing the intent for the resource and policies. The middle functional block is the intent deployment on the execution path, how we discussed that. And the last functional block is our ability to write the control loops on how we are doing the status aggregation, the metric aggregation, and how we are ensuring that the automated intent revisions are all happening through the control loop block. And the lower hand side shows how various regions and clusters and our resources on the cloud can be managed and can all be seen through a single pane of glass through Kubernetes managed construct using Nephio approach. With this, I will hand over to Kandan to take over and walk us through the remaining slides.
Thank you, Sana.
A quick question, Zena. In resource management, you think the categorization, because I believe the workloads will be categorized for services, for example, G node B components may come into small, medium, large, or core AMF or SMF functions may have similar things, or virtual switch for that matter. So would these kind of resource role-based categorization, would that be a CRD functions or would that be a resource manager function?
What do you mean by a resource manager in that?
So Modasar, can we hold the questions till the end, please?
We'll wait.
All right, so thank you. We will take the question at the end. So just want to add more to what Sana was pointing out. I just want to cover like a few slides on the progress that is already made by this community. And right now the community is supported by 70 plus companies. And there's about like 150 developers across all this company participate in this particular initiative. And Google, we provided a seed code for starting this community that including like some of the enhancement to the Kubernetes related to the concept that what Sana has talked about. And we are in the process of putting more code into the community. And we are targeting the first release on the first part of this year. And I will talk about that in detail in a minute. Let's go to the next slide, Sana. So this is a structure of the community that currently we are operating in. You can see the logos of the company that are participating as a TSC members. But again, TSC is welcome to everyone as any other Linux Foundation project. And currently there are 3 SIG groups that are part of this community. The SIG group 1 focused on primarily on the architecture, the requirements, collections, and discussion on like the overall structure of this, the automation itself. The second SIG group focus on like the development of this particular Nephio project. The number SIG 3 would primarily focused on like the release aspect of the project. And we have members from the community will present more with you guys like in the forthcoming hour. With that, let's go to the next slide, please. So this is a quick summary, and I think there's a lot of report that people, analysts have published. And if you're interested to read, I think some of this reports, you can actually refer that in detail. Some of them actually goes into the detail of like the benefits of this community and the challenges in the industry, and primarily talking about why this community would help you actually in having a better automation. So with that, let's go to the next slide. So here is a couple of pictures and of a different community event that has happened. And as we said, like this is like a newly formed community, happened in April last year. And after that, we had 3 summits and 2 large summits and 1 small meetup in India. And we have seen like a 500 plus people participating in this community events like over these 3 conferences. And let's go to the next slide. So community came together and brought all the seed code that is contributed by Google, plus like contribution coming from a different participant in the community. They put together the what I call as like 0.1 release of Nephio. And if you're interested to sort of like try yourself the initial version of it, and the intention of this initial version is to showcase like the aspect of the concepts and how the CRDs and operators can work with respect to the Kubernetes in the context of the telecom. And if you're interested, there is a video recording, and also the code is available as well as additional documentation explaining some of this concept in very detail. And if you're interested, you can actually scan this barcode, and that gives you the details. And let's go to the next slide. And there were 2 questions. I think I just want to touch that question as well. And you can write operator for any of the functionality that you want to do within the telecom. It can be a PNF as well, and it can be a VNF. But the community is very focused on initially on the container network function, because the whole industry is moving towards the container network function, especially with the 5G. People are looking for deployment using the container network function. And that's why the community is very focused on the container network function oriented operators and CRDs. But there is nothing limit us actually in creating a CRDs and operator to automate like a PNF. Given that there is already a penetration of tools from a PNF perspective, and it would be efficient to move towards the container network function, where like the true cloud native approach really comes in. And that is one aspect. The other aspect is there was a question about who would provide these operators and CRDs. And I have a slide to talk about it, but in a general level, the CRDs would be, very, very much defined in the community. Think of like the schemas, and the working principle of the CRDs is defined in the Nephio project. And in terms of the operator, as Sana was pointing out, like the community is putting forward the principles and the SDKs and things to create these operators. But again, the operator can come from the Nephio community itself, or it could come from some upstream communities, like for example, ORAN. And it could be operators coming from the providers that would support this, network function or the cloud infrastructure. So the operator can come from like many places, and you can write your own operator as well. And that is where this community is helping with additional SDKs and the schemas and procedures that allows you to quickly put together this operators, so that you can bring the automation into your company very quickly. So with that said, let's go to the next slide. So here is a map of like all the progress which is already has been done and where we are actually with respect to it. And as I said, like this community was formed in April of last year. And the community come together, actually assemble the initial version of the product. And right now the community is working towards the release 1. And as I mentioned that Google provided an initial code, and additional code is coming as well. And the community is also creating a lot of artifacts and code to really bring things together to make this release 1 successful. And we are targeting something sometime around the May, June timeframe. So the Q2 of this year, we would have a successful release coming out. But again, if you're interested to try out your version is already available in the community, which you can actually test it. And as I mentioned that the previous barcode gives you the link where you can actually see all the materials. And let's go to the next slide. So here is what coming in the release 1, and we are taking a baby step. And we are also very cautious about not super complicate the automation itself. So that is why we are using Kubernetes, because Kubernetes is supposed to be a simpler way of doing the automation. And that's that initial version of this one, which is a release 1, is like very focused on getting the fundamentals sort of like established, that including the Kubernetes being the control plane, and establishing the schemas, establishing the operators, and interworking of these operators. And there are some enhancements are needed actually in terms of the Kubernetes itself, and those are all upstreamed, or they are kept, if it is really related to the telecom, it is actually maintained in the Nephio community. But again, we don't have any intention to fork Kubernetes, and any upstream things will go to the Kubernetes community. But any downstream capabilities of the Nephio would be maintained within the Nephio community. And again, the success criteria that we are looking for is primarily, getting the framework, Kubernetes-based automation framework established for the telecom. And there would be, additional schemas and operators that establishes the next step towards the cloud native automation. So that's the goal of the release one. And there's also a bunch of tools around the, configuration, distribution to the edge nodes, and collecting the information about the status of a particular infrastructure or the network function, and loop that back into the controllers. And that's also been contributed into the release one. As Sana was pointing out, that the intention here is that to have an intent-based automation that gives you a complete autonomous network provisioning. So with that said, let's go to the next slide. So here is the sort of like a mind map of, or you can think of this as more of a user journey that the release one would deliver. So there is a set of configuration, management capabilities that would be part of the release one, and it's a fundamental capabilities of this Nephio. And that including, like somebody like a package author, they look at the configuration that is supported, what we call as the CRDs. And these YAML files can be edited and added like additional capabilities into it. And then there is a network designers who can actually review them and then provide an approval and associate that to a particular, either to a production or either to a lab, depending upon where this configuration has to go. Then there is a set of deployers that, primarily that goes and actually deploys that into the production. You can think this is more of like a different personas will operate on this particular sequence of events that an Nephio would support, and each persona has like a specific functionalities, like the way was mentioned that there are a set of authors, set of designers, set of like deployers, and then there is an operation team that manages the whole infrastructure. So this is sort of like a completely developed in a sense of what is needed to maintain and manage a complete network within the infrastructure. But again, there would be some default configuration that's coming along. But beyond the default configuration, the telecoms and who are supporting this particular Nephio at the production can actually modify configuration to support the specific infrastructure automation of the aspect. Right. So with that, let's go to the next slide, please. So this is our sort of like a welcome message to the community. And what is the benefit for CSPs? And the main benefit for CSP is that, there is always a dream to move towards a cloud native networks. So that's where the evolutions are happening. And this is one of the promise of 5G is that to move towards the cloud native networks. But the true cloud native network only comes in if a proper adoption of the automation also happens. So what we call as like a top to bottom layers that clearly come along as a cloud native network. So CSP definitely benefit from this particular initiatives. And the second thing is the cloud providers, this is a commitment, complete towards an open standard. And instead of proprietary standards and proprietary configuration, where pretty much the whole industry suffers. And this is where actually an open standard for a CRDs and operator that allows like a multi-cloud automation. And similarly, the network function vendors moving towards the, completely a cloud native based network and provide that, the network, the components like a network function can run on any Kubernetes and adopt this Kubernetes based automation using CRDs and operator would actually provide, easy way of maintaining like a multi-vendor network function, which is a desire of all the telecoms. So collectively, this benefits all the people and throughout the ecosystem of the telecom. With that said, let's go to the next slide. Here is a bunch of information. I think you can actually go and look at it. Again, this is an open community like any other community in Linux Foundation. And we pretty much welcome everybody to the community. And you can actually look at the blog post, which actually talks a little bit more about it. But again, you can try that, the version that I talked about. We also have a YouTube channel. So all the calls that's happening in the community is all recorded from the beginning of this project. So if you're interested, you can actually go to that YouTube channel and take a look at it. And we also have this GitHub where you can actually go and look at the code itself. And there is a bunch of distros that we follow like any other Linux Foundation community, and you can actually enroll to that distros. And if you have any questions, we also have a Slack channel, and you're welcome to participate in it. But again, the TSE calls happens like every Thursday, every 2 weeks on Thursdays, and there is a schedule for SIG group as well, and you are welcome to attend that. Whichever that one you're interested in. So with that, let's go to the next slide. Okay, so thank you very much, and we can take questions. And I think there were some questions on the chat. Sorry, we didn't follow all the questions on the chat, given that we are presenting. Please go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, no, this is good. Thank you so much, Condon and Sana. So Justin said his question was answered in previously, and Mudassar, it looks like your question may have been answered in chat.
Yeah, I think Vim kind of explained that. Thank you.
Okay, open to other questions.
Yeah, I have a question here. You mentioned that Nephio for deployment and configuration management. What about the upgrades? I mean, my question is, if we handle the upgrades, do we need to rework the CRDs and the operators, or only the CRDs?
So this project, this is a beautiful question, and I think this is a very important question as well. So this project really focus on day 0, day 1, and day 2 configuration, and this is important. And because just going and deploying, this is one of the pain points that currently with the existing infrastructure code as a deployment, basically it goes and, like, for example, if you take a Helm chart, and you can actually go and use a Helm chart to deploy it, then upgrading is like you need another set of Helm chart to really manage it. And it is super complex, especially when you have like so many number of locations, especially the RAN deployments, right? And with that said, like this project really cares for day 0, day 1, and day 2. And you can actually change the CRD that allows you to change the deployment, existing deployment. And again, the holistic principle here is that a continuous deployment and continuous upgrade, that is something like a cared for from the day 1 of this project. The other important thing to point out is that this is fully driven by CI/CD. All the configuration that are pushed from the CRDs to operator for invoking the Kubernetes and deploying a particular thing, it all happens through the CI/CD principle. There is a toolings that allows us that integration to happen. So Nephio provides that. So it's all CI/CD driven. So you can manage like a large number of locations with respect to this project using the whole CI/CD driven approach.
Thank you. Yeah, and do you have the upgrades are planned for subsequent releases, or because the CNF or VNF vendors are always coming with the new versions of their CNFs to come up with new features or enhancements. So they push the CSPs to upgrades. So I think the upgrade it's really important as well to be supported in the future releases.
Yeah, so the way we think about is that we are planning for a 6-month release cadence. So every 6 months, Nephio would actually have a release. But as I said, the operators themselves are either provided by the community or written by the cloud providers or the network function providers or the telecoms themselves, using the SDKs and the tooling that the Nephio community would provide. And depending upon how fast they need the upgrade onto that is something can be handled by the community or in the combination of the vendors who would support this Nephio in the production. But I think the community capabilities enhancement, we are looking at a six months cadence, where the first release is coming up in the May-June timeframe of this year. Then after that, every 6 months, there would be a new release coming up. But again, of course, like there would be patches and stuff like that would be happening in the middle of the projects.
Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, Madasser, looks like you're back on deck.
Thank you. What about the resource management? I believe a master orchestrator will have to keep some sort of view of inventory, what the Nephio operator Kubernetes can offer. Is that correct?
See,
I'll take this question.
Go ahead.
Sorry,
Go ahead.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
but I will take this question. We are currently in the stage of solving the exact same problem. For example, the way 3GPP describes their network slicing has to have an end-to-end view of resources. And exactly the way that we manage in the current deployment options, we have an end-to-end orchestrator that has to have a link to the inventory that manages your resources end-to-end. And then there are domain orchestrators. Those domain orchestrators have a bigger autonomy over your resources. And of course, that is also linked to the master or universal inventory at the same time. So we can replicate that architecture with Nephio, in which the end-to-end orchestrator has the visibility of the resources, but the autonomy of action is at the lowest level of the domain. For example, in the cloud domain, that is the core domain, the Kubernetes or the Nephio's layer would have the autonomy over the resources, but we can funnel that into the universal inventory and create that visibility at the upper level where the end-to-end resource management is happening. And the existing challenges of the feasibility check and making sure that the resources are reserved ahead of time, the way we could do that in the existing brownfield architectures today, we can do exactly the same with Nephio. It's a matter of extending our APIs upstream and allowing our interaction with the inventory. And I personally feel that this model of Nephio will be even more efficient than how we are seeing the resources, managing the resources, and taking the closed loop actions on it. It might get better, would be a very similar approach.
Like
does that help? Right,
yes.
Thanks.
Is any more question from anyone?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. Please go ahead.
Hello, I'm from China Mobile, and I have a question. Will Nephio will provide a REST API? If a third party use Nephio, can we use the function of Nephio through those REST API? And I think if Nephio provide a REST API, is those REST API is used to pass the CRD fields or directly call the function of Nephio through the interface? Thank you.
Yeah, so if I understand the question correctly, I think there is two sort of APIs that we are talking about, right? So the northbound Nephio provides pretty much uses the Kubernetes CRDs as APIs, right? So if you pass the CRD on the northbound of the Kubernetes, which is consumed by the operators, then if your question is like in the southbound, can I consume other REST API? Of course, you can actually consume other APIs, and necessary callouts that you have to make to Kubernetes or to the network function themselves to provision something, you can absolutely call out from the operators and in a particular sequence that you need, and that can be easily supported here. So the bottom line is the top northbound is all Kubernetes API. The southbound could be different varieties of API that operator can call in. But I think the intention, I think that as an industry as a whole, I think moving towards the Kubernetes sort of a deployment, meaning the CNF based true cloud native deployment is welcome. But we do understand that there may be some situation where network functions are still evolving. So different set of APIs could be called in to make the deployment happen.
Thank you. You means Nephio will have two kinds of APIs. One type is for source bound, or other one is for northbound, right?
Yes, so the southbound is really dictated by each network function or the cloud capabilities, and the northbound is dictated by the CRDs. The southbound, like it's if it is a generic Kubernetes-based, manifest that deploys the container network function, and I think it's a usual configuration management. But if there are any specific set of API, for example, like you want to automate a fabric, think of like a top of the rack switch need to be automated, and that needs an REST API call out or some specific configuration need to be sent out. The operator, Kubernetes operator, can do that as well, in addition to deploying the network function.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Okay.
So the southbound, sorry.
A quick one, in terms of analytics, since we're seeing the architecture is responsible for day 1, day 2 plus configurations, do you expect the service analytics and CNF analytics to be part of the Nephio architecture?
You can think of like a Nephio as a domain automation that including core, transport network, and RAN, even though the community is focused on the core and the RAN. There is some inherent capabilities of analytics is part of it, because in order to support the intent-based automation, because this is not a fire and forget, this is like a deploy it and look at the state and continue to monitor the state and continue to maintain that state. And in that consideration, there need to be some sort of feedback loop. And the community is primarily, using or planning to use the Prometheus-based, metrics to sort of like figure out the KPIs and look at the state of the system, and then feed that back into the operator so that this control loop can actually happen. But in terms of like full holistic analytics, that is not part of this community. What I mean by that is that, like complete data collection and the full data processing and putting that into, like a particular formats and stuff like that, that is not part of this community at this moment. But there is a minimal capability to accomplish that control loop as part of the community.
And you think that the APIs will allow the operator or MNO to ingest that data for their master network health monitor?
Yes.
All right, thank you.
Right.
Sure.
I will add one more comment to Kandan's great answer. As he mentioned, that Prometheus will actually give the Kubernetes or the operator layer a visibility into the health or the state of the network function. So it's something to focus on, that all the existing network functions must extend their analytics or their KPIs into something like Prometheus, which are visible by the Kubernetes layer. If they are legacy or SNMP based, we will not be able to leverage the benefit of Nephio, or we will not be able to plug that into the operators to achieve that closed loop. So the community has to evolve to be able to support the Nephio vision as well, all the functions that we're using.
So Sana, my intent here was, if you monitor the normal state of network health for any element, part of it is security monitoring too, and FCAPs. So if you have the control loop, it allows you to serve both O&M side and security side of the concerns.
Right. You would have to find a way for those tools to be able to send the trap or your trigger into Kubernetes. And maybe it's a very involved question, but there are some ideas, and there's some work that I have been exploring with some vendors too. It's a very vendor specific situation, but you need to find a way, how do you input that into Kubernetes layer. Natively, Kubernetes can absorb analytics from Prometheus, like Kandan mentioned, but if there is something coming from an external system that has to become a trigger to the condition of your loop, there are things that we have to do to ensure that we make that visibility or connection.
All right, thank you.
Okay, I heard Marshall's voice, but it looks like he asked his question in chat and it's been answered there. We've got time for one last question. Okay, well then, I think it's time for us to get prepped and shift gears for the next session.
So thank you guys. Really appreciate for the opportunity. Looking forward to have more collaboration, and you are all welcome to join the Nephio community, and looking forward to it. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.